The 3-day week when Britain lived by candlelight. It is a weekday evening in January 1974. In a terraced house somewhere in the Midlands, a family is finishing its tea by candlelight. A child is bent over homework at the kitchen table, squinting in the soft yellow light. The television set in the corner has already gone dark. By order, the broadcast ended at 10:30, and now there is nothing but the hiss of the gas fire and the scratch of a pencil. This is not wartime. There are no bombers overhead. This is one of the richest industrial nations on Earth. And yet across the country, the lights are being switched off by law. This is the story of the 3-day week. The story of how Britain came to live by candlelight in peacetime, and of the uncomfortable truth that the darkness would reveal. To understand how a modern country ends up rationing electricity, we have to go back to the early 1970s and to the fuel that kept the lights on. In 1973, Britain ran on coal. The great majority of the nation's electricity was generated by coal-fired power stations, and that coal came out of the ground by hand, dug by hundreds of thousands of British miners. The mines had been taken into public ownership in 1947, run by the National Coal Board on behalf of the nation. Coal heated the homes, fired the power stations, and moved the trains. When the miners were content, the country ran. When they were not, everyone would feel it. But the 1970s were uneasy years. Inflation was climbing month after month towards double figures. To hold prices down, the government of the Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath had capped pay rises across the public sector, and the men who dug the coal had begun to feel that their wages were slipping year by year, while the cost of everything around them rose. That quiet resentment would soon bring the country to a halt. Mining was hard, dangerous, unglamorous work. Around 270,000 men went down into the heat and the dust and the dark to bring up the fuel that powered Britain's homes and factories. Men died in the pits. Others carried the dust in their lungs for the rest of their lives. For a brief period after the war, that work had at least been well rewarded. In the late 1950s, a miner with a wife and 2 children could earn comfortably more than a man on a factory floor. By the early 1970s, that was no longer true. As inflation rose, the real value of a miner's wage was steadily eaten away. By the autumn of 1973, average earnings in the pits had slipped below the level that an official inquiry had recommended only the year before. The men who held up the nation's entire supply of power were watching themselves fall down the wage tables, and they knew exactly how much leverage they held. The National Union of Mine Workers asked for a substantial rise. The government, determined not to break its own pay limits, refused. And then, thousands of miles away, something happened that turned a domestic dispute into a national emergency. In early October, war broke out in the Middle East. In response, the great oil-producing nations of the Arab world cut their exports to the countries they judged had supported Israel and pushed their prices sharply upward. The effect was staggering. By the time the embargo ended, the price of oil had risen by almost 400%, from around $3 a barrel to $12. For a country that leaned on imported oil to fill the gaps in its energy supply, this was a hammer blow. Suddenly, every drop of fuel was precious. The government imposed a 50-mile-an-hour speed limit on every road in the land to conserve petrol. And it went further still. In the closing weeks of 1973, it printed petrol ration books and stockpiled them in post offices up and down the country, ready to be handed to motorists at a moment's notice. Those ration books would never, in the end, be used, but their quiet presence, sitting in their thousands behind the post office counters, told you everything about how frightened the country's leaders had become. Remember them. They will matter again before this story is done. Because the oil shock did not stand alone. It landed at the exact moment that the men who dug Britain's coal decided they had waited long enough. In November 1973, the miners stopped working overtime. It was not a strike. The men still went to the pits, still dug coal through their normal hours. But they refused the extra shifts, and without that overtime, production began to fall. Coal stocks at the power stations, already low, started to dwindle week by week. The government's response was immediate. Barely a day after the overtime ban began, it declared a state of emergency, the fifth such declaration in little more than 3 years of Heath's government. Ministers were handed sweeping powers to ration coal, oil, electricity and gas. There was one detail that is often forgotten. When the union balloted its members that November, they did not actually vote to strike. The proposal was rejected by something close to 2-1. For the moment, the overtime ban was as far as the miners were willing to go for the moment. But the pressure was building on every side. The Bank of England had pushed its lending rate to a record 13%. The country was running a vast trade deficit, and in December, the train drivers announced industrial action of their own, threatening the very trains that carried the coal to the power stations. The machinery of the country was seizing up, piece by piece. Then came the public campaign. Across the nation, posters and broadcasts urged ordinary people to save power with a simple, almost plaintive slogan: switch off something, turn off a light, heat one room instead of two. A modern country was being asked politely to use less of the electricity it had come to take for granted. Behind closed doors, the mood was far tenser than the public slogans suggested. The minutes of a cabinet meeting in December reveal ministers agreeing that the coming restrictions had to be put carefully, in a low key, as the record phrased it, stressing the overriding need to meet the fuel shortage, rather than a threat aimed at the unions. The government knew it was walking into a confrontation. It did not want to look as though it had picked the fight. And then, on the 13th of December 1973, Edward Heath went on television to tell the country what was coming. From the 1st of January, he announced, most of British industry would be restricted to 3 days of electricity a week. Factories, shops and offices that were not deemed essential would be allowed to draw power on only 3 specified consecutive days. For the rest of the week, the current would simply not be there. It was one of the most drastic peacetime measures any British government had ever imposed on its own economy, and it was about to reach into the daily life of every person in the country. What nobody could yet say was how far the miners themselves were prepared to go. An overtime ban had brought the nation to this point. The question hanging over everything in the cold opening days of 1974 was whether the men would stop there or whether they would walk out altogether. The 1st of January 1974 arrived, and Britain went on to 3 days a week. Try for a moment to picture it. A whole modern country going dark by law. In the factory towns, the great machines fell silent for days at a stretch. Workers were told whether their 3 power days would run Monday to Wednesday or Thursday to Saturday, and they arranged their lives around the gap. Some firms switched to 12-hour shifts on the days they had power to cram a week's work into half a week. Not everything stopped. Hospitals kept their electricity, so did the supermarkets, and, carefully, the presses that printed the newspapers, so that the public could be kept informed of what was happening to them. But for most ordinary workplaces, the rule was absolute. Shops could light their windows for only part of the day. Pubs and restaurants closed on the quiet days. Offices grew cold as the heating went off, and when darkness fell, families reached for candles and paraffin heaters, wrapping themselves in blankets and coats indoors. Demand for candles rose until the shops ran short of them. People boiled water on gas rings to wash because the immersion heater would not run. Even the nation's evenings were rationed. The television companies, the BBC and the commercial channels alike, were ordered to stop broadcasting at 10:30 each night to save the power. Across the country, families watched the picture shrink to a single white dot, watched the screen go black, and sat a while in the candlelight before bed. For the men and women living through it, it was strange and cold and unsettling. By some counts, around 1 million workers found themselves temporarily laid off, sent home because the factory had no power to run. Wages went unpaid. Small businesses, with no reserves to fall back on, began to fail. And yet, beneath all the disruption, something was happening that nobody had bargained for, something that would embarrass the government and the unions alike. In the factories that were running 3 days a week, the work was not falling by anything like as much as everyone had feared. Steel producers had predicted that industrial output might fall by half. Government ministers braced for catastrophe. But when officials later sat down to count the cost, the figures were far smaller than the warnings had promised. Output had fallen, certainly. The historian Andy Beckett, in his account of the period, has put the drop at around a fifth, yet other later estimates were lower still. By whichever measure, one fact was hard to escape. A country working 3 days a week had come far closer to its normal output than almost anyone had thought possible. It was an awkward discovery. For the unions, it raised a question about how hard the country truly needed to work. For the government, it quietly undercut the very sense of emergency on which its whole position rested. The darkness had revealed something uncomfortable about the way Britain worked, and the discomfort would linger long after the lights came back on. In the meantime, the dispute came to its head. In late January, the miners balloted once more. This time, more than 80% voted to strike. The overtime ban hardened into an all-out stoppage, and Edward Heath made the fateful decision of his career. On the 7th of February, he called a general election and fought it on a single question. Who governs Britain? The government, he asked, or the unions? Then, in the final week of the campaign, came a bombshell. It emerged through the pages of the Times that the official pay board had been working from incorrect figures for the miners' earnings. When the numbers were put right, it appeared the miners' claim might have sat within the government's own pay limits all along. The confrontation that had darkened the country, and the election now being fought over it, might never have been necessary at all. The voters gave Heath their answer on the 28th of February. It was not the one he wanted. No party won a majority. Heath spent a weekend trying to stitch together a coalition, failed, and resigned on the 4th of March. Harold Wilson returned to Downing Street at the head of a minority Labour government, settled with the miners on a rise of around 35%, and in early March, the lights came back on for good. In the Commons, while the crisis still raged, one member had stood and told the House something that would prove truer than he knew. Britain, he said, was at the end of an era of cheap energy, cheap food, and cheap raw materials. The country had glimpsed, by candlelight, just how fragile its comfort really was. Heath would face the voters once more that October and lose again, this time handing Wilson a narrow majority of just 3. The miners had, in effect, helped to bring down a government, and the memory of those dark weeks would shape the relationship between Britain's leaders and its workers for a decade and more. The 3-day week lasted barely 2 months, but its shadow stretched across the years. It had toppled a prime minister, exposed the deep fault lines between government and organised labour, and shown a modern nation just how quickly the lights could go out. For a few short weeks at the start of 1974, one of the wealthiest countries on earth had done its homework, run its factories, and gone to bed by the light of a candle. And it had learned that the comfort it took for granted rested on foundations far more fragile than it had ever imagined. If the forgotten corners of Britain's darkest history hold you the way they hold me, then consider subscribing. There is a new story here every week. And if this one stayed with you, then the story of the winter of discontent, the winter the dead went unburied, and the rubbish piled high in the streets, is one you will not forget.